Well, this week, as we got into chapter 7 of the Sermon on the Mount, we started looking at the issue of judging other people. In particular, I talked about how we can devalue other people, not seeing them for the inherent intrinsic worth they have just because they're a child of God. I mean, they may not be walking with God, they may not even know the Lord, but they are created in His image. And God sees them as His offspring, and so He just wants them to become part of the family by being born again. One of the problems we talked about yesterday was the fact that we have this inherent bias. We project on people, and as a result, we tend to deal with their imperfections with a great deal of impartiality. I find it's interesting in marriage because one of the dynamics we often say that opposites attract, and I think there's a degree of truth in that we're often attracted to something that's really a virtue in somebody else that isn't very strong in our own selves, and that's what draws us to us. We love to see that virtue that we wish was in us, and we somehow have the idea that if I marry this person, I'll somehow inherit that same virtue. The reality is that after a while, that virtue will become the thing that irritates you most about them, because it's almost like an accusatory finger. And the problem is you have an area where you have a strength, you have a virtue, and suddenly you begin to find yourself really competing with each other over the strengths that you have, and a lack of patience with the weakness that the other person has. I think my wife and I are a perfect example. She's highly organized. I mean, highly organized. And I'm, in certain areas, but not so much, particularly in terms of my physical environment. It's taken her 50 years to train me how to pick up after myself and do things in an orderly fashion. So I've developed some habits of organization and self-discipline in that regard, but it wasn't natural to me. It wasn't the way I was raised. And so the thing that used to drive her crazy about me was that I was just a scatterbrain. I'm the guy who forgets to lock the doors, forgets to shut the garage door. I mean, I just forget a lot of things I shouldn't forget to pick things up at the store. On the other hand, I tend to be fairly creative in certain areas. But for her, being organized is just as natural as sucking air. I mean, she just breathes organization. On the other hand, I used to get uptight because she seemed to be so fastidious and so concerned about all these little things that to me were no big deal. And so you find suddenly you're in this tension because the very thing that attracted you to that person in the first place is the very thing now that kind of you feel like puts an accusing finger on you, and you resent it and you begin to react. I tell my wife all the time that I said, I'm better with you than I'm without you. I like me best when I'm with you. Because that's the thing, is that there's a strength that she's brought into my life, and abilities and disciplines that I just never would have developed if I had married somebody who was more like me. So for those of you who wander around saying, well, I need to find my soulmate, be careful what you wish for, because you might get exactly what you're like, and you'll find that you'll drag each other down and keep yourself from becoming all that you can be. God has a wisdom in why He does things the way He does, which really kind of brings me to where we're at today in verse 3 of chapter 7, where Jesus says the following. He says, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank that's in your own eye? I mean, how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when all the time there's a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye." Now, the reality is we all have specks in our eyes, and a speck can be quite irritating. I mean, if you get something in your eye that even it's a little small piece of dust, it makes your eye water, you have trouble focusing, and you're really kind of tortured until you get that thing removed. And I found that there's been times where I've had to actually have my wife look in my eye and irrigate it a little bit with eye drops and remove what was there, because I simply couldn't get it out. And I really appreciate that. And that's a wonderful thing. So he's not saying that we shouldn't try to remove those personality specks or cultural specks or even moral or ethical specks that we have. We can all have these little things in our eye that really keep us from being able to see things with great clarity. But at the same time, if you come to me to remove a speck and you have a plank, you got a 2x4 in your eye, I am not interested in allowing you to touch my eye. And the question comes out, what is the speck? Well, the speck is some kind of flaw in you, some area of failure, ethically, morally, or whatever. But what is the plank? And I think the plank is lovelessness. It's when we see that thing in another person's eye, but we want to remove it without loving care. And think about it. If you tried to pull a speck out of somebody's eye with a 2x4, you'd probably destroy their eye and you'd blind them. And I know people who have been blinded by the scriptures as it was used by others against them. People use the Word of God as a condemning hatchet or axe or club to hit them over the head, and they became twice the child of hell they were before they ever had the gospel yelled at them. You know, we're told to preach the gospel, not to yell it. We're told to treat people, not to beat people. And those are kind of distinctions that are really important, because we all have specks. We all need somebody to help us get them out of our eyes, but we also need them to do it with loving care and with great caution, that they respect my eyesight and what's blinding me, and they want to remove it so I can see things clearly. Well, that's how it is when we're correcting other people. In fact, in Galatians 6:1, Paul said, if you see your brother overtaken in a fault, go to him in the spirit of meekness, considering yourself, lest you also be tempted. In other words, he's saying, before you begin to really criticize somebody for a failure in their life, step back and say, do I have that same flaw in me? Am I the same way? You know, when I rebuke somebody for being angry, am I angry? If I rebuke somebody for being jealous, am I jealous? If I rebuke somebody for being proud, am I proud? Well, I have to plead guilty to that. I think that's one of my besetting sins. But the simple fact of the matter is that regardless of how we may find that distasteful, we need to do whatever procedure we do with surgical care, that we're not trying to settle a score or to punish somebody. You know, the old adage, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and it was Gandhi who said if we do that, we'll all be toothless and we'll be blind. And that's the simple reality, is that we don't want to go around damaging people because they have flaws. We want to help them to find the way that they can really see clearly for themselves what is the narrow path, and they can walk in it. So we'll continue with this as we spend this week talking about our least favorite subject, judging other people wrongly and unfairly. Look forward to tomorrow.